Mexican cartel infiltrates ICE detention facility. Unaware it's guarded by former Delta Force unit. The night was cold. Bitterly so? A thin layer of frost had already begun to form on the windows of the ICE detention facility. The kind of frost that marked the arrival of winter along the US-Mexico border. The stars in the sky were hidden behind a blanket of dark clouds. As if the heavens themselves were conspiring to conceal the horror that was about to unfold. Inside the high-security facility, the air was thick with tension. The prison, located just a few miles from the border, housed some of the most dangerous criminals from Mexico. Drug lords, cartel members, human traffickers, all locked away behind reinforced walls. Under constant surveillance. This was a place where nightmares were supposed to be kept. And for the most part, it had been successful. But tonight, something was different. Something was stirring. In the control room, a young officer named Sarah Gomez sat at the monitoring station. Her eyes flicking from one screen to the next. The usual hum of surveillance cameras and alarms was drowned out by the thundering pulse of her heartbeat. She'd been stationed here for nearly a year now. And while the job was demanding, she'd grown accustomed to the long shifts, the monotony, the occasional minor disturbances, things that never truly broke the routine. But tonight felt different. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as if some primal instinct was warning her. Something was coming. Her fingers tapped nervously on the desk. But she kept her eyes focused on the screens, knowing that a slip in attention could have devastating consequences. The facility was a fortress, designed to withstand almost any attack. Barbed wire, electrified fences, motion detectors, and armed guards. It was built to keep the most dangerous criminals from ever escaping. But there were rumors, whispers in the underground world of drug cartels, of powerful men willing to pay anything to break their comrades out of custody. And those whispers had become louder. "Everything's normal," Sarah muttered under her breath, trying to reassure herself. But deep down, she could feel it. The unease gnawed at her. The warning signs were there. And her gut told her that the rumors were more than just talk. On the other side of the facility, in the depths of the prison, the inmates had begun to stir. It was late, well past lights out. But there was an eerie calm in the air. The guards, stationed in their posts throughout the compound, were alert but unaware of the threat brewing just outside the gates. No one knew that. Just a few miles away, a group of men was preparing to infiltrate the facility. And these men weren't ordinary criminals. They were members of the infamous Los Zetas cartel, one of the most ruthless and dangerous criminal organizations in Mexico. For years, they had ruled over the drug trade with an iron fist, leaving a trail of violence and bloodshed in their wake. And now, they had a new mission, to break their imprisoned comrades out of the ICE detention center. No matter the cost. The plan had been set into motion weeks ago. It started with gathering intelligence on the facility's security systems, studying every routine, every pattern. They had bribed a few of the facility's workers, gaining access to the inner workings of the detention center. They knew everything, the guards' shifts, the blind spots in the surveillance system, even the weaknesses in the facility's physical defenses. And now, tonight, the time had come to strike. The cartel members, led by Rafael Ortega, a cold-blooded enforcer with a reputation for cruelty, gathered in the shadows. just outside the perimeter of the detention center. They were armed to the teeth, ready for the violence that was about to unfold. Their plan was simple: breach the outer defenses, cause enough chaos to overwhelm the guards, and free their comrades. But there was one thing they didn't know. The facility wasn't just guarded by ordinary security personnel. It was guarded by a team of elite soldiers. Men who had seen the horrors of war and emerged from it stronger, more dangerous than ever before. These men were former members of the Delta Force, an elite counterterrorism unit that had operated in some of the most dangerous regions of the world. They had been handpicked for this assignment, chosen for their skills, their loyalty, and their ability to handle any threat, no matter how daunting. At the helm of this group was Matt Miller, a man whose face was as hard and cold as the steel walls of the facility itself. Matt had served in Delta Force for over a decade, fighting in wars and conflicts across the globe. He had seen things that most men couldn't even imagine, and he had learned to trust his instincts, his training, and his team. When he had been offered the job of overseeing security at this detention facility, he had accepted without hesitation. It was a quiet assignment, a break from the chaos of battle, or so he had thought. But now, it seemed the peace was about to be shattered. As Raphael and his men made their move, they thought they were dealing with a simple prison break. They had underestimated their enemy. The team of former Delta Force operatives had prepared for this moment long before it had arrived. They knew that an attack on the facility was not a matter of if, but when. Every guard had been trained in countermeasures. Every corner had been surveyed, and every escape route had been blocked. The first sign of trouble came at 11:45 p.m. when the outer perimeter alarm was triggered. A flicker on one of the surveillance monitors caught Sarah's attention. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw it, a shadow moving along the fence line, just outside the range of the security cameras. Her eyes widened as the shadow multiplied, becoming a small group of figures creeping closer to the facility. "Shit," she whispered under her breath, her fingers flying over the keyboard, attempting to activate the emergency lockdown. But it was too late. The cartel members were already inside. On the other side of the compound, Matt Miller stood with his team in the operations room, watching the same footage. The moment he saw the figures breach the perimeter, his instincts kicked in. This wasn't a routine escape attempt. This was an orchestrated attack. And it was happening now. "Get ready," he barked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "We've got company." His team moved with precision, slipping into the shadows of the facility, their movements calculated and silent. They were ghosts, invisible in the night, ready to face whatever danger lay ahead. Back in the control room, Sarah watched as the screens filled with images of the cartel members moving through the facility. They were fast, methodical, and dangerous. She knew that help was on the way, but it wouldn't arrive in time to stop the attackers. It was up to her and the guards to hold the line until reinforcements could reach them. "Matt," she spoke into her radio, her voice shaking. "They're inside. What do we do?" "Stay calm," Matt replied, his voice a calm, reassuring presence in the chaos. "We've trained for this. Just keep them out of the core sections. We'll handle the rest." And with that, the battle for the ICE detention facility began. The sounds of gunfire echoed through the halls as the cartel and the former Delta Force operatives collided in a brutal struggle for control. The fate of everyone inside the facility hung in the balance as the two sides fought for survival. The night had only just begun. And neither side knew that this was going to be a fight for more than just freedom. It was going to be a fight for life itself. The night was only beginning. But the tension in the air had already reached a boiling point. As the cartel members advanced through the facility's outer perimeter, the men who had spent years training for the most dangerous operations in the world were already in motion. The night would not belong to the criminals. Not while Matt Miller and his team still breathed. Inside the control room, Sarah Gomez's hands shook as she tried to maintain her composure. Every alert, every flashing light on the screen, made her feel like the world was closing in around her. Despite the high-tech security systems, despite the reinforced gates and barriers, the cartel had managed to breach the outer fence with an almost eerie precision. It felt as if they had anticipated every move, every contingency, every countermeasure she could throw at them. "What do we know about their position?" Sarah asked, trying to hide the growing panic in her voice. She was a rookie in a facility built to house the most dangerous criminals. But nothing could have prepared her for this. "Not much yet," came the terse reply from one of the other officers in the room. "They're moving fast. But they're being strategic. They're not firing. Not yet." But Sarah knew that would change soon. The men outside weren't interested in making noise. They were here for a specific purpose, to break their comrades out and leave nothing behind. The radio crackled. And Sarah's heart skipped a beat. It was Matt's voice, cool, measured. The voice of a man who had seen combat. Who had faced death more times than most people could count. "Sarah, listen closely. We've identified the breach points. Your job is to lock down the entry points. The longer we can keep them from reaching the core of the facility, the better our chances." "Understood," she replied quickly, trying to shake off the weight of the moment. She wasn't prepared for this, none of them had been. But there was no time to second guess. She had to act. In the shadows of the detention center, the cartel members moved like specters. They were well trained, organized, and ruthless. Every move had been calculated. They knew exactly where to strike. And they were taking no chances. Rafael Ortega, the man leading the operation, was a seasoned enforcer, known for his unyielding brutality. His reputation alone was enough to strike fear into the hearts of even the most hardened soldiers. "Stay low," Rafael ordered his men as they approached the first set of security gates. They were close now. The dull thud of boots on the frozen ground was muffled. And their breath steamed in the frigid air. But nothing could stop them. Not now. The plan had been in motion for weeks. The cartel had paid off several insiders, low-level guards and facility workers, to help them gather intel. They knew every door, every camera, and every schedule. But the biggest surprise would come when they breached the next phase of their plan, the control room. As they neared the first set of reinforced gates, Raphael raised his hand, signaling for a halt. They needed to disable the security system. And quickly. His eyes locked onto one of his men, Javier, who nodded before pulling out a small, sophisticated device from his bag. A few quick movements, and the gate's security system flickered to life, then went dark. "Good work," Raphael muttered as the gates slowly began to lift. They had their opening. They moved quickly, slipping through the now open gates, and into the heart of the facility. The sound of their movements was drowned out by the distant hum of the alarms, which continued to blare, alerting the guards. The distraction would keep them busy, but it wouldn't stop the cartel from reaching their goal. Meanwhile, Matt Miller's team was already moving into position, their eyes scanning every corner of the facility. Their senses heightened. The team was a quiet, lethal force, a mix of men who had spent years in combat zones. From Iraq to Afghanistan. From counterterrorism operations to covert missions. They had seen it all, and their training had prepared them for moments like this. Matt moved like a shadow, flanked by two of his most trusted men, Jake and Nick. The three of them had served together in Delta Force, and their bond was stronger than any military unit could forge. They moved silently, slipping through the hallways with deadly precision, making their way toward the control room. "Stay tight," Matt whispered, his voice barely audible. "We've got less than 5 minutes before they hit the inner perimeter." Jake nodded, checking his weapon and scanning the hallway ahead. Nick was on the other side, covering the rear. Every footstep they took was deliberate, calculated. They couldn't afford to make a sound. Not when they were facing a group of cartel members who were just as deadly as they were. In the control room, Sarah was frantically typing away, trying to lock down every possible exit and entry point. She had already activated the lockdown on the main gates, but she knew it wouldn't hold for long. The cartel had access to sophisticated tools, and it wouldn't take them long to breach the inner layers of security. Her radio crackled again. It was Matt's voice, calm but with an edge she hadn't heard before. "Sarah, get ready. They've made it to the perimeter. We need you to hold them off as long as you can. We're moving in now?" A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. She had been trained for emergencies, but nothing could prepare her for this. She wasn't just a rookie anymore, she was the first line of defense. And everything she did in the next few minutes would determine the outcome of the battle. "Understood," Sarah replied, her voice steady. But inside, she could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her chest. She keyed in a few more commands, trying to delay the cartel's advance. But even as the systems blinked green, signaling that the lockdown had been initiated, a sinking feeling settled in her gut. The cartel was inside. They were already making their way deeper into the facility, and the sound of their approach was growing louder. "Sarah, stay focused." Matt's voice came through the radio again. "We're counting on you." She could hear the urgency in his words, but she pushed it aside. She had a job to do, and she would do it, no matter what it took. With one final keystroke, she secured the gates leading to the inner halls. As she looked up from the console, she caught sight of the armed guards rushing toward her. They were the best in the business, but she knew that no matter how well trained they were facing an enemy unlike any they had dealt with before. This wasn't just a prison break, this was an all-out assault on the facility. And every second mattered. Outside, the sound of the cartel's movements grew louder. The men were close now. Raphael and his team were relentless, pushing forward with only one objective in mind: escape and freedom. But little did they know, the real battle was just beginning. Matt and his team weren't going to let them leave without a fight. As the facility's interior descended into chaos, Matt's voice rang out once more. "Move in. We take this facility back, one room at a time." The time for silence and shadows was over. The war for control of the ICE detention center had begun. The walls of the ICE detention facility had always been its greatest defense. Thick concrete and steel, reinforced by advanced surveillance systems and constant patrols, formed the bedrock of its security. The cartel, however, was not concerned with the strength of walls or the height of fences. They had long since mastered the art of evasion. And tonight, their enemies would learn the true meaning of surprise. As the first wave of attackers infiltrated the facility, Sarah Gomez felt the room shift around her. The hum of alarms blared in her ears, the screens before her flashing chaotic images of figures moving through the hallways. The camera feed showed them slipping past security, slipping through blind spots in the system that she had worked tirelessly to monitor. It was like watching a nightmare unfold before her eyes. She slammed her hand on the button that activated the lockdown. A harsh beep sounded, but the screen didn't show the green light she was hoping for. "Come on. Come on," she muttered, her heart racing. Sweat beaded on her forehead. No matter how prepared she thought she was, nothing had prepared her for the reality of this breach. "Sarah. Status report." Matt's voice crackled in her earpiece, low and controlled, but with an edge of urgency she couldn't ignore. "They're through the outer gates," she reported, voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "I've activated the lockdown, but they're bypassing some of the security. I don't know how they're doing it. The cameras aren't picking them up fast enough. Focus on keeping them from reaching the inner halls. Don't worry about the cameras, we've got that covered. We're moving in." His voice cut through the air like a sharp blade. And for a moment, Sarah closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She trusted Matt and his team. They were the best, and they would find a way to stop the cartel. In the darkness of the facility, Rafael Ortega's group was methodically moving through the shadows. They knew they had little time to waste. Every second that passed, every moment the guards grew more alert, meant a greater risk of failure. Rafael moved at the front of the pack, his eyes scanning every corner, every door, every window. He could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of expectation heavy on his shoulders. This wasn't just about money or power. This was about survival. They had come for their own. Their comrades, locked away in cells deep within the facility, had been abandoned to the US government's custody. It was a risk, but it was one they were willing to take. There was no turning back now. Raphael glanced at his men. Their faces set in stone, hardened by years of violence and betrayal. They were all familiar with death. Some had danced with it. Others had used it as a weapon. But there was no room for hesitation tonight. No room for weakness. They had a job to do. "Move up," Raphael ordered in a low, guttural voice. His eyes glinted with a mix of hunger and cold determination. "Get to the east wing. The guards will be in place soon. We don't have much time." The group moved through the shadows, creeping toward the east wing of the facility. They knew that once they reached that area, the real battle would begin. The guards in that section were better trained, more prepared. But Raphael had a plan. He always did. As the cartel members continued to advance, Matt Miller's team was closing in on their location. The former Delta Force operatives were silent, their movements practiced, as though they had rehearsed this moment countless times. The team was made up of men who were no strangers to danger. Matt, Jake, and Nick were like shadows themselves, moving in perfect synchronization as they approached the core of the facility. "We're about 2 minutes out," Matt said, glancing over at his team. His face was impassive, but inside, his mind was racing. Every scenario played out like a chess match in his mind. "Jake. Nick, take the left corridor. I'll move down the middle. We need to catch them in the crossfire." "Got it," Jake responded, his voice steady. But there was an edge of anticipation to it. It wasn't just the adrenaline of the moment that drove them. It was the knowledge that the cartel was not to be underestimated. If they didn't act quickly, lives would be lost. The group split, each man silently moving toward their designated corridor. The echo of their boots on the floor was muffled by the thick walls. But they knew that time was running out. They were moving toward the center of the action. And soon the real confrontation would begin. Meanwhile, inside the facility, Raphael's men had reached the East Wing. They had successfully avoided the majority of the guards on their way here. But that was about to change. The section ahead was heavily fortified, and they would have to breach it if they were going to free the cartel's imprisoned members. As Raphael moved forward, he raised his hand, signaling for his men to stop. He crouched low, eyes scanning the hallway in front of him. He could hear the faint shuffle of footsteps, guards. No doubt. It was time to move. With a quick nod, the men sprang into action, moving in sync as they stormed the first guard post. The chaos erupted in an instant. Gunfire rang out in the confined space, and the bright flash of muzzle fire lit up the hallway like lightning. The guards didn't stand a chance. They had been taken by surprise. And within moments, the men of lost letters had overrun their position. Raphael didn't hesitate. He had no time for hesitation. He moved swiftly, kicking open the doors to the control room of the East Wing. He knew that this was the heart of the facility's operation. And if they could gain control of it, they would be one step closer to their objective. But as Raphael and his men breached the doors, they found something they hadn't anticipated. Matt Miller and his team were already waiting for them. There was no time to think, no time to plan. As soon as the doors crashed open, the room erupted in gunfire. The cartel members scattered, trying to find cover. But Matt's team was faster. The former Delta Force operatives were trained for this. They were prepared for chaos. "Move! Move! Move!" Matt shouted, his voice like a command from a battle-hardened general. He didn't give the cartel a moment to recover. Jake and Nick flanked the left side of the room, their weapons up and ready. The air was thick with tension as both sides sought to gain the upper hand. Raphael's eyes locked onto Matt's, and for a brief moment, the two men seemed to understand one another. This wasn't just about survival. It was about proving who was stronger. The firefight continued to rage, each side pushing, retreating, and trying to outmaneuver the other. The sounds of gunfire echoed down the hallway, drowning out everything else. But amidst the chaos, one thing became clear: this fight would not be won easily. The men of lost letters were relentless, and Matt's team was equally determined. As the dust began to settle, and the flashes of gunfire slowed, it became evident that this was only the beginning. The battle had just begun, and both sides knew that only one could walk away victorious. Outside the facility, the winds howled against the walls of the detention center. The storm was only just beginning. The flicker of a dying light cast long, jagged shadows across the cold concrete floors of the facility. The air inside the ICE detention center was thick with tension, and the staccato sound of gunfire still reverberated in the walls. A constant reminder that everything had changed in an instant. The battle that had erupted in the East Wing was far from over, and the real test had only just begun. Rafael Ortega, leader of the Los Zetas cartel operation, was crouched behind a metal pillar, his breath ragged as he tried to steady his nerves. His men were regrouping, but the intensity of the firefight had taken a toll. The cartel was good, he knew that much, but the men in Delta Force, they were in a league of their own. Every move, every reaction, was calculated. This wasn't just a fight for survival, this was a war for dominance. Rafael gritted his teeth, wiping blood from his forehead where a stray bullet had grazed him. His eyes flickered towards the door to the control room, now barricaded with heavy crates and metal furniture. The guards inside were momentarily subdued, but he knew it wouldn't take long for them to recover, for Matt Miller and his team to regroup. He adjusted the grip on his weapon, the cold steel pressing against his palm, and gestured to his men. "We push forward," he muttered, his voice low but filled with determination. "We take this room or we die trying." The group nodded in unison, tightening their formation as they moved toward the barricade. But as they crept closer, a series of sharp, distinct noises echoed from the darkened hallways. Footsteps, approaching fast. "We don't have time?" one of his men said, his voice tight with urgency. Raphael's instincts kicked in. "Split up. Move fast. Don't let them box us in." As his men scattered to take cover behind the broken barricades and shadows, the door to the control room was kicked open with a force that made the room shake. The men of Delta Force had found them. Matt Miller's face was a mask of cold focus. His eyes scanned the room quickly, taking in the sight of the cartel members, the chaos that had taken place just moments before. His mind raced through the scenarios: how many were left, where they were hiding, what was the quickest route to stop them before they could regain control. There was no room for hesitation. "Jake. Nick," he barked, his voice cutting through the silence of the room. "Secure the left flank. I'll take the right." Jake and Nick moved quickly, silent as shadows, while Matt advanced alone toward the center of the room. Every step was purposeful, every movement calculated. The corridor ahead was a war zone. Tables were overturned, and discarded weapons littered the floor. It wasn't just a simple breach anymore, it was a full-on assault. The cartel wasn't going to back down. They were desperate, and desperation made them dangerous. A sudden burst of gunfire broke the quiet tension, and Matt dove behind cover, narrowly avoiding the barrage of bullets. He exhaled sharply, his body coiling with energy. "They're close," he muttered to himself. Then, louder, he spoke into his earpiece. "Hold tight. We're not letting them take this ground." On the other side of the facility, Sarah Gomez sat frozen in the control room, her fingers hovering over the console. Her mind raced as she tried to process the information flooding in. She could see the movement of the cartel members on her monitors. They were skilled, organized, and they knew what they were doing. Her job now was to track their movements and coordinate with Matt's team. But with every second that passed, The situation was becoming more dire. She had to keep them contained. She had to help them buy enough time for the team to take control. Sarah. Matt's voice crackled in her earpiece. We're closing in on them. How are we looking on the lockdown? Sarah's fingers flew over the console, trying to reroute the facility's security measures. I've got the lockdown in the main hall. But they're bypassing the backup systems. They must have inside knowledge. This isn't just a random attack. They planned this. I know. Matt replied curtly. Just keep the system running as long as you can. We'll handle the rest. No matter what happens. Don't let them get to the core. Sarah's heart beat wildly in her chest. But she fought to keep her voice steady. Understood. Inside the East Wing. The battle was heating up. Raphael and his men had taken cover behind an old, rusted filing cabinet. Their weapons aimed at the door that led to the control room. They could hear the footsteps of Matt's team advancing. Moving closer. But the walls of the detention facility seemed to stretch on forever. The echoes of battle making it impossible to predict where the next strike would come from. Raphael clenched his teeth and whispered to his men. We hold here. Don't give them an inch. But even as he spoke, the sound of heavy boots approaching grew louder. They had only moments to act. The tension was suffocating. And then? The door burst open. Matt was there. A ghost in the darkness. Moving faster than the cartel could react. A bullet from his rifle found its mark before they had a chance to raise their weapons. The crack of the shot was deafening in the small room. Raphael ducked behind the filing cabinet, narrowly avoiding the return fire. His pulse quickened. This was it, the moment of truth. Get ready, he hissed to his men, motioning for them to flank Matt. We take him down now. But before anyone could move, Matt's voice rang out. Calm but filled with deadly authority. Not today. In a flash, Matt dropped to a knee, his rifle snapping up with uncanny precision. With the practiced speed of a man who had seen it all, he took out one of the cartel members as they tried to make a move from the left flank. The man crumpled to the ground before his comrades could even respond. Another burst of gunfire rang out as Nick and Jake moved into position, cutting off any escape routes. The cartel members were surrounded. They fought back fiercely. But it was clear they were outmatched. Raphael knew it. Fall back, he shouted. We regroup. Fall back to the south wing. But the call came too late. Matt and his team had already begun closing in. They were relentless. And no matter how fast the cartel tried to retreat, there was nowhere to go. They were trapped in a deadly game of cat and mouse. And the team of Delta Force was always one step ahead. With a final, desperate attempt, Raphael pulled a grenade from his vest and tossed it toward the door. The explosion rocked the room, sending debris flying. Dust filled the air, choking the fighters on both sides. But when the smoke cleared, Matt and his team had already neutralized the last of the cartel's remaining forces. Raphael, battered and bloodied, turned to make a break for it. But he didn't get far. Matt was there, standing in front of him with a look of icy determination on his face. End of the line. Ortega, Matt said calmly. Raphael raised his weapon. A last, desperate act of defiance. But Matt was faster. The shot was precise, a single bullet that ended the fight once and for all. With the main threat neutralized, Matt's team began sweeping the facility. making sure that all remaining cartel members were accounted for. But even as they secured the area, one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. There was more to this operation than just a prison break. And, as the dust settled, Matt could feel it. There was something much bigger at play. "Stay alert," Matt ordered. "The real fight is still ahead of us." But for now, the immediate danger was over. The cartel had been stopped, but the mystery behind their attack remained. The air in the facility had settled after the chaos of the last few hours. But an unsettling stillness lingered. The hallways, once echoing with the sound of running feet and gunfire, now stood eerily quiet. The air was thick with dust and tension. And yet, no one could shake the feeling that this was far from over. The cartel's attack had been stifled for now. But the bigger picture, the motive behind this raid, was still unknown. Matt Miller knew that they had to uncover it. And fast. Before more pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Matt walked through the facility's darkened hallways, his eyes scanning every corner. He didn't like the quiet. It felt wrong. It felt like the calm before a storm. His team had been methodical, clearing every room, ensuring the cartel had been neutralized. But something in his gut told him there was more to this attack than a simple prison break. Behind him, Jake and Nick moved in perfect synchronization, their weapons still raised, alert for any movement. They had worked together for years, facing enemy forces across the globe. They were more than just a team, they were a family. And right now, they could sense something was off. "You think we're done here?" Jake asked, his voice low. Matt shook his head. "No. I don't think so. This feels like a diversion. A distraction to something bigger." Nick looked over at Matt, his brow furrowing in thought. A diversion? For what? Matt paused, his gaze drifting toward the distant hallway. The walls were lined with security cameras, the flickering lights casting long shadows on the floor. His eyes narrowed as he considered their next move. "That's what we need to figure out." Meanwhile, in a small, dimly lit room deep within the facility, Rafael Ortega was far from finished. The explosion had scattered his men, and the Delta Force team had gained control of the East Wing. But Rafael wasn't one to give up easily. Bloodied and bruised, he had made his way to the back of the facility where a small, nondescript door led to a hidden underground tunnel system. The tunnel system was the last part of his plan, the escape route that had been prepared in case everything went wrong. It wasn't much, but it was enough. His breathing was labored as he made his way down the narrow, damp tunnel. He could feel the weight of the loss in his chest, his men, the failed assault, but there was something more important at stake. They had a job to do, and he couldn't afford to let it slip away. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, his hands trembling. "Boss," a voice on the other end said urgently. "We've got a problem. The intel was compromised. The authorities are closing in faster than we thought. We need to move now, or we lose everything." Raphael's mind raced. He wasn't expecting this. His men had been in the facility for hours, and the last thing they needed was an unknown variable disrupting their plans. But Raphael knew how to think on his feet. This wasn't over. Not yet. "Make sure the train is ready," he said coldly into the phone. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. And make sure no one follows me. Understand?" Yes, boss. The voice responded, filled with urgency. We'll hold it for you. Raphael ended the call and shoved the phone back into his pocket. He wasn't sure who had compromised their position. But right now, it didn't matter. What mattered was getting out. And the train waiting on the other side of the tunnel was his ticket to freedom. Back in the facility, Matt's team had gathered in the operations room. The tension thick between them. They had secured the facility. And the remaining cartel members had been rounded up. But there was still no clear understanding of what the cartel had been after. Matt didn't like how easily the operation had collapsed. How quickly they had lost control. He had a sense that something else was at play. And he wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers. "Where's Ortega?" Matt asked. His voice cutting through the air like a knife. "We've swept the East Wing. He's not here," Jake replied. "We think he might have gone underground." Nick raised an eyebrow. "Underground? There's no record of any tunnels in this facility." "Maybe not in the official records," Matt said, his eyes narrowing. "But there are always holes. There are always routes people think no one knows about." They exchanged a brief look of understanding. They needed to get to the bottom of this. And they needed to do it fast. Matt had a feeling that Raphael wasn't just trying to escape, he was running towards something much bigger. A higher stakes game that had yet to be revealed. "We're going to search every inch of this place. Jake. Nick, we'll cover the ground level. I'm heading down to the tunnels," Matt ordered. His voice firm. "We'll find Ortega. And we'll find out what the hell he was really after." Raphael's footsteps echoed as he neared the end of the tunnel. The air down here was thick. Humid with the scent of earth and decay. He felt the pressure mounting. The authorities were closing in. And every minute brought him closer to being caught. He had to make this count. As he emerged from the tunnel into an underground chamber, he saw it, the train. It was old. Rusted in places. But it was a small piece of the cartel's secret network. And it was his escape route. A black SUV was already parked near the tracks. And two of his men were waiting. Their eyes scanning the dark surroundings nervously. They knew they were on borrowed time. "Is everything set?" Raphael asked. His voice still raspy from the smoke and dust of the explosion. "Yes, boss. The train is ready to go," one of the men replied. His voice tight with anxiety. "But we need to leave now. We don't know how long it'll be before they track us here." Raphael nodded grimly. "We leave in 5 minutes. Make sure the tracks are clear." As he approached the train, Raphael's mind was already calculating his next move. He knew that the authorities would be tracking every step. Every action they took. They couldn't afford to be caught, not now. He needed to get out of the country. Find a way to lay low. And then strike back when the time was right. His work wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Back at the facility, Matt was making his way down a narrow hallway. His footsteps heavy as he approached a large steel door. His breath was steady. The weight of his weapon familiar in his grip. He had followed every lead. Every trail of breadcrumbs. And now he had reached the place he knew he would find the answers. Behind the door was the access point to the underground tunnels, the very same tunnels Raphael had used to escape. As Matt entered, he felt the temperature drop. The musty air of the tunnels filling his lungs. He had to find Raphael, before he disappeared for good. Matt's mind raced as he pieced together the puzzle. Why would the cartel go to such lengths? Why not just stage a simple prison break and get out? No. This was something more. And then it hit him. Raphael wasn't running from them. He was running towards something. Something, or someone, that Matt had yet to uncover. As Matt reached the end of the tunnel, he heard the sound of a train in the distance. The rumble of the wheels against the tracks, growing louder and louder as it neared. Matt's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't going to let Raphael escape again. The chase was on. The train tracks ran deep under the earth, hidden from the world above. The sound of the approaching train grew louder, vibrating through the walls of the underground tunnel. Matt Miller's footsteps quickened as he sprinted. Every breath sharp and controlled. He knew time was running out. Rafael Ortega and his cartel were close to slipping away. And Matt wasn't about to let that happen. He had followed the trail through the darkened halls, past the makeshift barricades and the remnants of their last confrontation. Now, with each step, the rumble of the train beneath his feet seemed to pound harder. A reminder that the clock was ticking. If he didn't catch Ortega now, it might be the last chance to stop the cartel's escape, and whatever larger plan they had set in motion. Matt's mind raced. The tunnels? The secret train. It all pointed to something much more significant than a simple breakout. There was a far-reaching operation underway. And Rafael Ortega was at the center of it. But the deeper Matt dug into the situation, the more the questions multiplied. Why go to such extremes? What was so important that it couldn't wait until the cartel's usual operations? Was this about more than just freeing a few comrades? It didn't matter right now. His priority was stopping Ortega before he disappeared for good. As Matt reached the tunnel's exit, he saw the faint light of the train's headlights in the distance. The tunnel curved sharply ahead. And he knew that within moments, Raphael and his men would be gone. The train wasn't just an escape route, it was the last piece of their carefully laid plans. And Matt had no intention of letting it slip away. With a final burst of speed, Matt reached the tunnel's mouth. He could see the train now, an old, battered freight train with a nondescript cargo car in the back. Raphael's black SUV was parked nearby, the engine still running. Two men were standing guard near the train, weapons in hand, scanning the darkened surroundings. They had clearly been expecting someone to come after them. Matt's instincts kicked in. He dropped into a crouch and moved silently, his movements deliberate and precise. He didn't need to take them all out at once, he just needed to stop them long enough to reach Raphael and learn what was really going on. He pulled his gun from its holster, adjusting his grip as he moved closer. His heart beat in his chest, each thump driving him forward. The guards hadn't spotted him yet, but it wouldn't be long before they did. Rafael Ortega stood by the train, his eyes flicking nervously between his men and the train as it prepared to depart. His plan was simple: get out, get far, and never look back. But even as the train's brakes squealed and the engine rumbled, something gnawed at him. The attack on the ICE detention facility had gone down smoother than expected. But the arrival of Matt and his team had complicated things. Despite the firefight, despite the chaos, Raphael felt the heat of the pursuit closing in on him. He reached for his phone, glancing at the screen. There were no new messages, no updates from his men. He needed to move fast. Is everything clear? Raphael asked. his voice tight with urgency. "Yes, boss," one of the men replied. "But we need to go now. The authorities are closing in." Raphael nodded. But his thoughts were elsewhere. He had given everything to this mission. The cartel's power. His freedom. It was all riding on this moment. But even as he stood at the precipice of escape, the nagging feeling that something was off refused to leave him. Before he could speak again, a gunshot rang out from the darkness. The sound echoed through the cavernous tunnel. Sharp and jarring. One of the guards by the train collapsed to the ground with a muffled thud. Blood pooling around his body. The second guard swung around in a panic, searching for the source of the shot. But he didn't get the chance to react. A second shot rang out. And the second guard fell, his weapon clattering to the ground. Matt Miller emerged from the shadows, his gun lowered, but his eyes razor-sharp with focus. His team was right behind him, each one moving silently, their weapons drawn and ready. "Move," Matt ordered in a low, controlled voice. Jake and Nick sprinted toward the train, covering Matt's six as they advanced. But Matt wasn't thinking about the train right now. His eyes were locked on one thing, Rafael Ortega. He could see the man standing near the train, his back to Matt. But he could also see the tension in Rafael's posture. He wasn't giving up without a fight. "Rafael," Matt shouted, his voice carrying across the distance. For a split second, Rafael froze, his body stiffening. But then he turned, his eyes flashing with recognition. "I knew you'd come," Rafael said with a twisted smirk, his voice filled with a mix of defiance and frustration. He raised his weapon, pointing it directly at Matt. "But you're too late. You should have stayed back." Matt didn't flinch. He took a step forward, his hand steady, his eyes unblinking. "It's over, Ortega. There's nowhere to run." Raphael's lips curled into a cold smile. "You think this is over? You have no idea what you're stopping." He stepped back toward the train, his hand still gripping the gun. "The cartel's not finished. What's coming next? You'll never see it coming." Matt didn't hesitate. The situation had gone far beyond a simple standoff. Raphael was dangerous. But Matt had seen men like him before. He knew how to handle them. With one swift motion, Matt raised his gun. The barrel aimed directly at Raphael's chest. "Get on your knees," Matt ordered, his voice unwavering. For a moment, it seemed like Raphael would resist, that he would make one last attempt to escape. But then, something in his eyes flickered, a brief moment of hesitation. A flash of understanding that there was no way out. Raphael's shoulders slumped, and he dropped his gun to the ground, his face a mask of anger and defeat. "You're too late," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Matt didn't respond. He didn't need to. The fight was over. The last of the cartel's forces had been neutralized. Rafael Ortega had been captured. As Matt handcuffed the man and pulled him to his feet, he glanced back at the train. The sound of the wheels was still there. But now it was just an empty promise. The escape had been thwarted. And whatever plans Raphael had made, they would never come to fruition. But even as Matt stood there, holding the cartel leader in his grasp, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger loomed just beyond their reach. This was only a small part of a much larger puzzle. And he was far from finished. "We're not done yet," Matt said, looking back at Jake and Nick. "But we're closer to the truth than ever." Rafael Ortega's eyes narrowed as he was led away. But even in defeat, the fire of something darker burned in them. This wasn't over. It had just begun. The sun was beginning to rise on the horizon, casting a muted orange glow over the abandoned ICE detention facility. The sounds of the night's chaos were fading away. But the stillness that replaced it carried an ominous weight. Matt Miller stood outside the now secured perimeter of the facility, the cool morning breeze ruffling his jacket as he gazed down at the subdued figure of Rafael Ortega, who had been tightly handcuffed and seated on the ground, his face grim. Matt couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that had settled in his gut. Ortega's capture had been a victory. Sure. But the deeper he dug, the more the pieces seemed to fit into a picture that was far from complete. Rafael had been quick to surrender when faced with no escape. But there had been something more in his eyes, something Matt couldn't quite place. Defeat? Sure. But also a glimmer of something darker. A knowledge that the game wasn't over. "We've got him," Jake said from behind Matt, his voice a little too tight. "But I don't think he's the only piece to this puzzle." Matt turned slightly, meeting Jake's eyes. His teammate was right. They had Ortega in custody. But this felt far from finished. The cartel's operations ran deep. And a man like Rafael Ortega was no pawn. He was a key player in something bigger, something much more dangerous. "Let's take him back," Matt said, his voice firm. "I want answers. And I want them fast. Every minute we waste, he gets farther away from us." Inside the secure holding area of the facility, Matt and his team watched as Ortega was placed in a holding cell, his face hard as he surveyed his new surroundings. The once confident cartel leader now looked like a man who had lost everything: his empire, his freedom, and his ability to control the fate of his men. Matt stood across from him, his arms crossed, his eyes steady. "You know what happens now," he said, his voice low but commanding. "You talk, or I make sure your life in here becomes a living hell." Rafael stared at Matt, his expression unreadable. He remained silent for several moments, the weight of his defeat clearly pressing on him. Then he spoke, his voice rough but laced with a hint of disdain. "You think capturing me will stop it? You think that ending my little operation will make the rest of it go away? Who's behind this?" Matt demanded, his patience thinning. "Who else is involved in your little scheme?" "Ortega." Rafael leaned back against the cold concrete of the wall, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "You don't get it, do you?" He chuckled darkly. Then his eyes shifted to Matt. "This isn't just about me. This is about the bigger picture. The global reach. You think my cartel is the end all? Be all? You've barely scratched the surface. You really want to know the truth?" Matt's jaw tightened. "We have all day, Ortega. We can sit here until you break. But I'm not leaving until I get answers." Rafael studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Fine. You want the truth. There's a network, an operation much larger than anything you can imagine. What you've been chasing, all these cartel busts, they're only a distraction, a sideshow. The real operation, the one that matters, is happening right under your noses. The train. That wasn't just an escape route. It was the tip of the iceberg. Matt stepped closer to the bars, his eyes narrowing. What are you talking about? The cartel is just one part of it, Raphael continued, his voice growing colder. But the real players are the ones who have the money and the power. People who have been operating in the shadows for years. Pulling strings across borders. Manipulating governments. Law enforcement. Hell. Even your own people. His eyes flicked towards the guards standing nearby. You think you're safe from them. You think you're the ones calling the shots. Matt's breath caught in his throat as the weight of Raphael's words began to sink in. This was more than just a cartel trying to break free. There were bigger forces at work, forces beyond his control. And perhaps even beyond his understanding. The system that he and his team had been fighting for was possibly riddled with corruption. And this was just the beginning. We're not dealing with simple criminals, Raphael continued. His voice now a whisper. We're talking about an operation that's been decades in the making. Every country, every law enforcement agency, there are people in power who will stop at nothing to maintain control. They want to pull the strings from the shadows. And that means you. And everyone like you is expendable. Matt took a step back. His mind reeling. He couldn't process everything all at once. He had spent years fighting the cartel. But what Raphael was suggesting, was it even possible? And the train? Matt asked. His voice quiet but laced with suspicion. Why was it part of this? Raphael gave him a small, grim smile. The train wasn't just for me. It's for everyone who needs to disappear. It's a conduit for moving people. For laundering money. For running weapons. Drugs. And whatever else you can think of. But the real purpose. It's for the ones who need to vanish. The ones who have a target on their back. They can hide anywhere. Cross any border. No one will ever know. Matt clenched his fists. The realization slowly dawning on him. It wasn't just about getting Raphael and the cartel off the streets. It was about taking down a network of corruption that spread far and wide, people who used their power to erase their tracks. To hide behind layers of deception. The train was just one small part of a much larger operation. The air in the holding cell was thick with the weight of Raphael's words. Matt stood there for a long moment. Considering his options. He couldn't let Raphael's confession go unchallenged. This wasn't just about one man's capture, this was about exposing a global network of corruption and crime. We're going to take this apart, Matt said. His voice cold with determination. I don't care how deep it goes or how far it stretches. I'm going to expose every last one of them. And you, Ortega, you're going to help me. Raphael didn't respond right away. But there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew that Matt wasn't going to back down. That this wasn't some simple game of cat and mouse. It was war. If you think you can bring it all down. Raphael finally spoke. His voice low and filled with a touch of admiration. You're braver than I thought. Matt stepped back. Looking over his shoulder at his team. We have work to do, he said firmly. We'll start by finding out exactly who's behind this. And then we're going to bring it all to the light. Outside the holding cell. Jake and Nick exchanged uneasy glances. They could see it too, the magnitude of what they were dealing with. The cartel had been just the tip of the iceberg. And now, Matt was leading them into a fight they had never anticipated. A fight against a network so vast. It threatened everything they had fought to protect. Are you sure we can handle this? Jake asked. His voice low but filled with the uncertainty that had begun to settle in his chest. Matt didn't look back. We have to? No one else will. The battle ahead would be harder than anything they had faced before. But one thing was certain, the war for justice wasn't over. It had only just begun. And Matt Miller wasn't about to let the darkness win. They had a world to save. And they would fight until their last breath to bring the truth to light. The sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the cold, grey interior of the ICE detention facility. Outside, the world was waking up. But inside, it felt like a battle zone. Still reeling from the events of the night. The halls were quiet now. But there was a palpable tension in the air. As the team gathered in the operations room, their minds were filled with the weight of what they had just uncovered. Rafael Ortega's confession had set off a chain of thoughts that none of them could shake. Matt Miller stood at the front of the room, his hands clenched behind his back, staring out at the officers and agents who had been assigned to assist them in securing the facility. His mind was racing. The cartel had been a problem. Yes. But it was clear now that the situation had morphed into something much more dangerous. This was about more than just drugs or weapons. This was about power. Global power. And it was controlled by people who had no boundaries. No morals. And no regard for the rule of law. What do we know about Ortega's connections? Matt asked. His voice steady, but the edge in it unmistakable. His team had been working hard to piece together everything that Rafael had revealed. But the more they dug, the more the labyrinth of corruption and crime seemed to stretch out in every direction. Jake, standing beside him, answered. We're still compiling the data from his phone and the intel we pulled from the servers. There's a lot of encrypted files. A lot of names we don't recognize. He paused. But we're seeing patterns. There are people at the highest levels. And not just in Mexico. This isn't just a cartel problem. This is an international issue. Nick chimed in, his voice grave. We've pulled records that show connections to high-ranking officials in multiple countries. And the train, it's not just transporting criminals. We've tracked it across borders. From Europe to South America. And even into the United States. This thing is massive. Whoever is behind it has the means to operate without detection. They've been covering their tracks for years. Matt exhaled sharply, his frustration mounting. We need to get ahead of this. If there's a network this large, we're dealing with far more than Ortega's operation. Whoever is running this, they've planned for everything. They've covered every exit. Every possible oversight. Matt turned to Sarah, who had been listening intently from the back of the room. Her face grim as she worked on her laptop. She had been tirelessly sifting through surveillance footage, trying to find any clues that might lead them to the next step in the investigation. Anything from the security cameras? He asked. Sarah looked up, meeting his gaze. We've been tracking movement in the facility. And I've flagged a few unusual anomalies. There's a group of men, high-level players, who entered the facility just before the attack. Their faces are blurry in the footage. But they're moving in a way that's organized. Almost military. Military? Jake repeated, his eyebrows furrowing. Sarah nodded. Yeah. They were well coordinated. This wasn't just a hit job by a random group of cartel enforcers. These guys knew exactly where to go. What to do. A sense of dread settled over the room as the realization hit. It wasn't just the cartel that was pulling strings. There were other, darker forces at play. Matt let out a low curse, rubbing his hand over his face. Whoever these men are, they aren't working for Ortega. He's just a pawn. We're not looking at a cartel anymore. We're looking at a conspiracy. Great, Nick muttered. A conspiracy. That's exactly what we need. Matt ignored the sarcasm in Nick's voice. We need to get ahead of this. We have to find the people behind it. We need their names, their contacts, everything. Jake tapped a few keys on his laptop, his eyes scanning the data. We've got a list of potential names based on the encrypted files. Some of them are in the system. And others, he paused as he glanced over the next piece of data, are completely off the grid. We're talking about shadow figures. People who operate without any official records. Matt's thoughts swirled. The trail was getting deeper. And every lead felt like it was slipping through his fingers faster than he could catch up. We need to put pressure on Ortega, Matt said. His voice sharp. He might know more than he's letting on. And right now, he's our only lead. Down the hall, Rafael Ortega sat alone in his cell, the lights dimming above him. He was still reeling from the earlier confrontation. His mind racing. He had given them just enough to bait them, to make them think they were onto something. The last thing he wanted was to be a pawn in someone else's game. But now it seemed that was exactly what he was. The cartel had been only a small part of the operation. But the bigger players were in the shadows, lurking, waiting for the right moment. Raphael's eyes flickered to the small window in the corner of his cell. But he knew that escape wasn't an option. At least, not yet. He needed time to figure out his next move. He needed to get back in touch with his people, with the ones who really held the power. The problem was, he wasn't the only one thinking that way. Somewhere, deep within the facility, Matt Miller and his team were closing in. Their eyes on the same prize, the truth. And with each passing minute, that truth seemed darker and more dangerous. Matt stood outside Ortega's cell a short time later, his mind calculating the next steps. He couldn't trust the man. Raphael had already proven that much, but they didn't have much choice. He was the only one who could provide any insight into the shadowy network they were up against. He glanced at Jake and Nick. We need to put the pressure on. He's hiding something. And we need to get it out of him. Jake gave a quick nod. We'll keep the heat on. But we need to be careful. He's smarter than we think. Matt turned to Sarah. Keep digging. I want every last scrap of intel on those off-the-grid contacts. We need to understand who we're really up against here. The hours passed in tense silence. The team continued their work, sifting through the data, while Matt remained focused on Ortega. He was beginning to understand that this was no longer just a fight to stop a few criminals. This was the beginning of something much larger, a fight against an invisible enemy with far-reaching influence. And the deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. By the time they reconvened in the operations room, the air was thick with anticipation. Sarah's report came first. I found something, she said, her voice low. It's a name. A name that keeps popping up in the encrypted files and on some of the contacts we've been tracing. Matt's pulse quickened. What name? Sarah hesitated for a moment before speaking the word that would change everything. Tanner Rhodes? The name meant nothing to Matt at first. But the expression on Jake and Nick's faces told him everything he needed to know. Rhodes wasn't just any name. Tanner Rhodes was someone with power. Real power. What do we know about him? Matt asked. His voice quiet but filled with urgency. Jake nodded grimly. Tanner Rhodes isn't just a businessman, or a political figure. He's been operating in the shadows for years. But the real kicker. He's tied to several military contracts. Private security firms. And, he paused. His voice dropping. He has connections with people at the highest levels of government. People who control everything from arms deals to intelligence operations. Matt's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It was a global operation, one that reached into governments, corporations, and the very fabric of the power structure itself. Rhodes is the mastermind, Matt said. His voice steely. And Ortega is just the messenger. We need to go after Rhodes. Now. As they prepared to launch the next phase of the operation, Matt realized something crucial. The battle they were fighting wasn't just for justice. It was for control. And the fight would get far uglier before it was over. The day had stretched into evening. And the facility was quieter now. But the tension in the air was palpable. Matt Miller stood before a wall covered in surveillance photos, encrypted files, and reports. The name Tanner Rhodes seemed to glow in neon against the dark backdrop of the investigation. Everything they had uncovered, every lead they had followed, pointed toward him. Rhodes wasn't just a man. He was the pivot upon which an entire global network of corruption turned. This is bigger than we thought, Jake said, looking over Matt's shoulder at the growing evidence. He rubbed his temples, as if trying to force the pieces together in his mind. Rhodes isn't just a shadow player. He's the puppeteer. Matt nodded. His jaw clenched. The more they learned about Rhodes, the more he felt the weight of what lay ahead. I know. And what bothers me, is that we've been chasing shadows for too long. We don't know who else is involved. How far his reach extends. We've got to act fast. Nick added. His voice heavy with the realization that this was no longer just a tactical operation. It was a fight against an enemy that had influence in places they hadn't even begun to touch. The deeper we dig, the more people we uncover who have something to lose. Matt turned away from the wall and faced his team. We need to go after Rhodes. We need to hit him where it hurts, wherever he's hiding. His operation has already infiltrated too many areas we care about. We can't let this fester. We don't even know where he is, Sarah said. Her voice softer than usual but filled with determination. This guy's like a ghost. The only place he hasn't been able to hide is his financial empire. Matt took a deep breath. Sarah was right. Rhodes had covered his tracks incredibly well. But the one thing he couldn't hide was money. It always left a trail. And this time? It was the key. We start there. We track every financial transaction. Every connection. We start small, then work our way up. Sounds like a long shot, Nick said. Skeptical. If Rhodes has been running operations this well, there's a good chance even his financials are protected. That's why we're going to make him slip, Matt said with quiet confidence. Everyone makes a mistake. Even the people who think they're untouchable. The team set to work, sifting through financial documents, offshore accounts, wire transfers, and anything that could reveal a trail leading to Rhodes. They were up against time. against the vast resources of a man who knew how to hide. Who understood the game of power at its most dangerous. As the hours stretched into the night, they found something crucial. "I've got a match," Sarah said. Her voice sharp with the realization. "A transfer. Made just 2 days ago. It's tied to a shell company with connections to one of Rhodes' private security firms. And that's not all. The transaction was routed through a series of international banks. All with accounts in his name." Matt's heart skipped a beat. "You're telling me this is it? We have him?" "It's a start," Sarah replied. "But we're going to need more. This is only one transaction. It's a significant one. But Rhodes knows how to cover his tracks. It's going to take some time to trace the rest of the money. We'll need to follow the money trail wherever it leads us." "Good. Keep digging," Matt said. A fire in his eyes. "But we're not waiting. We need to find out where Rhodes is hiding. And we need to do it fast." Hours later, the team was gathering around a table. The exhaustion etched on their faces. Sarah had pulled a mountain of data together, her hands shaking slightly as she pieced the financial connections together. There were patterns, leads. But it was still far from clear. Every time they thought they were close, the trail would split again. Then, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. "Wait a minute," she said. Her voice low but urgent. "I've found something. A private airstrip. Registered to one of Rhodes' shell companies. It's located just outside of Tucson." Matt straightened. "You're sure?" "Yes," Sarah said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "There's a small plane registered under the same company. And it's been used to make regular flights between various countries, mainly South America and Europe." Matt exchanged a glance with Jake and Nick. They knew what that meant. Rhodes is still out there. He's not hiding in some mansion. He's on the move. Using the airstrip as a way to get in and out without anyone noticing. Jake nodded. "We've got a small window. We need to take action before he disappears again." Matt took a deep breath. "We hit that airstrip tonight. We don't wait." The team geared up for the mission. Every one of them aware of the risk they were taking. A small, private airstrip on the outskirts of Tucson wasn't exactly a high-profile target. But it was a key piece of Rhodes' operations. Matt had no doubt that if they could capture Rhodes here, they would finally have the leverage they needed to break the conspiracy wide open. The journey to the airstrip was silent, save for the soft hum of the engines and the occasional crackle from the radio. Each member of the team was focused. Their thoughts running parallel to Matt's. Was this it? Was this the moment that would end the network? Or would they come face to face with something they weren't prepared for? As the helicopter touched down near the edge of the airstrip, Matt's pulse quickened. He motioned for his team to move. And they swiftly disembarked, their boots crunching against the gravel runway. The night was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the terminal building ahead. It was a quiet place. Eerily still. Matt's voice was steady as he signaled for the team to spread out. "Stay sharp. We move fast. And we move quiet. We're not here to make noise unless we have to." They moved like shadows. Each member of the team in sync. Eyes scanning every corner. Every darkened area. As they approached the terminal building, Matt felt the tension in his body. Something didn't feel right. It was too quiet. And then, as they neared the hangar, they heard the unmistakable sound of an engine starting, too late. A private jet's engines roared to life. "Shit," Matt muttered. "He's leaving." Without a second thought, Matt broke into a run, his team following behind. They could see the plane now, the lights flicking on as it began to taxi down the runway. The massive jet was preparing for takeoff, its engines screeching as it powered down the strip. "Stop him," Matt yelled. "We can't let him get away." Jake and Nick split off, sprinting toward the end of the runway, while Matt kept his eyes fixed on the jet. It was moving too fast. If they didn't stop it now, Rhodes would be gone, and their chance would slip through their fingers. In the distance, Matt saw the jet's nose begin to lift. They were running out of time. "Now," Matt shouted. With a quick motion, Matt pulled out his weapon and fired a single shot, aimed at the tire. The shot rang out in the night, echoing across the airstrip. The tire exploded. The plane lurched to one side, the screech of metal on concrete filling the air. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then the jet skidded off the runway, the screeching tires coming to a sudden halt. The team was on the move, already closing in. They had him? The jet shuddered to a halt on the runway, smoke billowing from the damaged tires. Matt Miller felt his heart pounding in his chest as he sprinted toward the disabled plane, his team hot on his heels. The sound of the jet's engines dying down reverberated through the night, leaving only the heavy breaths of the team members in the otherwise still air. They had finally cornered Tanner Rhodes, the puppet master behind the global web of corruption they had been chasing for so long. Matt signaled for Jake and Nick to take the left side of the plane while Sarah, with her knowledge of the facility's security systems, moved to the right. They needed to be thorough. No mistakes. No loose ends. He kept his eyes locked on the jet's exit, ready for whatever move Rhodes would make. As the team moved in, Matt could see the figures inside the cockpit, moving with urgency. Rhodes was smart, and he knew he had little time before Matt's team closed in completely. But they weren't giving him an out. They couldn't. "Don't let him escape," Matt muttered under his breath, the words a command to himself more than anyone else. They reached the plane in seconds. Jake was the first to board, his weapon ready, eyes scanning every inch of the cabin. Nick was right behind him, moving quickly, taking control of the rear. But there was no sign of Rhodes. "Clear?" Jake called out from inside the cabin. Matt's heart sank. They had expected a confrontation. But now, his stomach twisted with the thought that Rhodes might already be gone. His mind raced. But then a voice cut through the stillness. "It's too late." Matt spun around, his hand instinctively going for his weapon. Standing at the edge of the runway, framed by the dim light from the terminal, was Tanner Rhodes. His presence was like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over the entire operation. The moment Matt's eyes met Rhodes, the cartel leader's expression was filled with dark amusement. Rhodes didn't seem fazed. He wasn't running. He wasn't even trying to escape. In fact, he looked almost relieved. "You're too late, Miller," Rhodes said, his voice carrying in the quiet night air. "You think capturing me will stop what's coming? You think this was about me? You're wrong." Matt stepped forward, his hand still on his weapon but his focus sharp. "Where's the rest of it, Rhodes?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Where is your network? We've been chasing shadows for too long. This ends tonight. Rhodes smiled, his eyes glinting with something almost sinister. This doesn't end. This is just the beginning. You've been chasing the wrong thing all along. Matt. The words hung in the air like a trap. Something in Matt's gut tightened. He was missing a piece of the puzzle, something bigger was at play. You think this will all disappear? You've built a web so tangled. There's no way out. Rhodes tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. I'm not the one in control. None of us are. You think you've won? You think you've defeated me? Or stopped anything? You have no idea who's pulling the strings. The weight of his words hit Matt harder than he expected. He had been so focused on taking down the cartel, so determined to bring down one man that he hadn't realized how deep this went. This wasn't just about corruption or power, it was about control on a scale he couldn't even comprehend. Rhodes was a piece of the puzzle, yes. But he wasn't the heart of it. Matt had been fighting the wrong battle all along. I'm not going anywhere, Rhodes said, his voice now almost mocking. The people who run this world, they're watching you right now. And if you're thinking of taking me down, you better know, they're already preparing for the next phase. Matt didn't flinch, though his mind raced. He needed answers, now. Who are they? He demanded, taking a step toward Rhodes. Rhodes didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a deliberate step back, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. You'll never find them. Not now. You've exposed too much already. They'll make sure you don't get far. Matt's pulse quickened. He wasn't about to let Rhodes slip away. But he knew the man wasn't about to break. There was something bigger out there. And Rhodes was too deep into it to talk. The team had to regroup and get their bearings. If they had even a chance of taking down whoever was behind this, they had to play it smarter than they ever had before. You'll be locked up for a long time, Matt said, his tone cold and final. Rhodes didn't respond. Instead, he glanced briefly over his shoulder. And Matt knew he was about to make one last attempt at control. But Matt was ready for him. Before Rhodes could make a move, the sharp sound of helicopters filled the air. Matt looked up, his gut sinking. It wasn't just one helicopter. It was several, coming in fast. They've already sent for backup, Rhodes said, his grin widening. You really think this is just about me? They're here. And they won't let you take me. A cold chill ran down Matt's spine. Rhodes was right. The conspiracy went beyond him. Beyond anything Matt had imagined. The very forces that controlled the highest levels of power were mobilizing. And they weren't going to allow Matt and his team to dismantle the web that had been built over decades. The sound of rotor blades grew louder. And Matt felt the weight of reality hit him all at once. He was caught in the middle of something much bigger than he had ever anticipated. The truth was dark. And it was elusive. They had exposed a sliver of it. But the rest of the operation, the heart of the conspiracy, was beyond their reach for now. Matt's voice was steady as he turned to Jake and Nick. Get ready. We're not letting him go. But Rhodes was already laughing. As if he knew something they didn't. As if, no matter what they did, it didn't matter. The battle was only just beginning. And in that moment, Matt understood, the war they were about to face wasn't just for justice. It was for the future of everything they held dear. And the shadows that had been lurking in the dark corners of the world were only just beginning to step into the light.